Gosh, what a whirlwind of a 24 hours we have had. Of course, yesterday, New Zealand time, round about now, 24 hours ago, President Donald Trump inaugurated once again, and certainly been busy since then. What will be the impact not just on the United States, but on the rest of the world, including us here in New Zealand? Joining us on the program now, a Democracy Project expert on the geopolitical scene, Geoffrey Miller. Geoffrey, kia ora, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Good morning, Andrew.
It certainly has been a dramatic 24 hours, but we kind of knew it was going to be. Firstly, the inauguration process itself, that certainly had some surprises, some talking points.
Indeed, I watched it yesterday morning. It was on early in the morning, 6 a.m. New Zealand time. It was a bit different to inaugurations of the past. I think because it had been moved inside it did lack something of the pageantry that the inauguration typically has, being outside there. I think it lacked some of the energy for Donald Trump. The speech that he gave was very much like one of his campaign addresses. Would be like one of the speeches he would make at his rallies, but yet he didn't have that big crowd there behind him, so it felt a little flat, to be honest, to me. But yet there was a lot of substance in it, which I think was actually quite useful, because I think it's always useful to know what politicians are going to do. And Trump was very, very specific, right down to talking about renaming the United States' tallest mountain, for example. Typically in inauguration addresses, incoming presidents, they focus on values, and they talk all about, the promise of America, and, how it's the shining beacon on the hill, etc. With Donald Trump, there was none of that. It was just a laundry list of all his grievances and all the things he was going to change and do. So we learned a lot from his speech about what his priorities are going to be.
Including in his inauguration speech was, doubling down on, oh gosh, I didn't lose the election last time. It was a total fraud, despite, a mountain of evidence, perhaps America's tallest mountain of evidence on the topic. And, from there, straight out of the gate, he's already pardoned the insurrectionists that were part of the protests at Capitol Hill, that stormed the Capitol, that assaulted police officers. They've got their get-out-of-jail-free card, thanks to Trump.
Indeed, he's standing right behind his backers, as he would see them, and he's issued those pardons. Of course, Joe Biden, as he left office, issued a huge number of pardons himself. It was the largest number of pardons by far of any recent president, and well into the thousands, including preemptive pardons for his own family for any crimes they may have committed since 2014. It was quite extraordinary. So obviously this is precedent setting, and we're going to see future presidents probably do the same kinds of things. Everyone's going to be afraid now that they're going to be put in jail by the next president. So we're going to probably see more of these pardons being issued. And just generally, of course, with these pardons that Donald Trump has issued, he's clearly using the tools available to him as president, and it's a very powerful one, the ability to issue a pardon.
I wanted to talk to you about that aspect, actually, because the Biden pardons, they literally are get-out-of-jail-free cards for any offence that they may be charged with. You can just keep it in your back pocket in case somebody finds some dirt on you. This type of regime change, out with the old, in with the new, that there is criminal prosecutions taken against the outgoing group. This sounds more like something you might expect in a Middle Eastern regime change, rather than the land of the free and the home of the brave. I mean, I know Middle East is a specialist area for you. What's your thoughts on that, Geoffrey?
Well, look, I think the umbrella term for all of this is polarization. We've going from one extreme to another. Under the Biden administration, it was quite a globalist presidency, if you like. It was about working with other countries, working together, supporting organizations like the UN, the WHO, or at least in rhetoric terms. You can argue about whether the Biden administration actually typically did that, when you think of things like what's happened in the Middle East over the past 15 months, particularly with Gaza. But that was the rhetoric, that we're going to work together with our allies. We're going to be internationalist in our outlook to a large extent. With Donald Trump, it's the opposite, and so he's promising to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord the WHO, the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
He's doing a lot of the extreme kinds of things in the other direction. So we're going from one extreme to another. And I guess with the pardons, again, it comes back to what I said that the previous president is afraid that the next president is going to take action
Yeah.
against him. And that was, I guess, what Joe Biden was afraid of, that once Donald Trump was in power, he would be vindictive and take action against Joe Biden and Joe Biden's family and use the powers of the presidency, which I guess by convention is not something that previous presidents have tended to do. They've
Yeah.
tended to focus on the future rather than on settling the score with their past opponents.
Looking at the international scene, I mean, the two big ones, of course, pulling out of World Health Organization and also the Paris Climate Accords. Is this indicative of where things may be going with Donald Trump's response generally to United Nations or even NATO? Is this a sign of things to come, do you think?
I think so. Remember, America first.
Yep.
That's the Trump foreign policy in a nutshell, and he's very much living up to that slogan. Now, he did do this before in the first term. He also laid the ground to withdraw from the WHO, but because of the notice period, it didn't actually come into effect. He issued the notice to withdraw in 2020, and Joe Biden was in office before it could be enacted.
Yep.
This time around, because he's doing it on day one, it will happen. And likewise with the Paris Climate Accord, the US did pull out, but there was a longer notice period for technical reasons the last time around. This time around, I believe it will be in simply a year's time that the US will be out. So the US will be out of the WHO, will be out of the Paris Climate Accord for at least a 3-year period, I guess, until you have a new US election. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen in 2028.
Yep.
Maybe the Trumpism will live on in the form of President J.D. Vance. I mean, we've got no idea what will happen. But at least for several years, the US is going to be out of these big multilateral deals, if you like, the WHO as an organization and the Paris Climate Accord. That's pretty significant. The US is the biggest funder by far to the World Health Organization, which does an awful lot of good around the world, particularly in developing countries, but just generally when it comes to things like pandemics. So it is sad to see the US taking its ball and going home effectively on this. I think it would be better, to work within the system and to try and reform it if you don't like the WHO and the way it's acting, to try and make it even better for the future. I think that would be more constructive. I mean, I don't think we should see any of these organizations or agreements as above criticism and above critique. You have to be able to critique these international bodies and organizations and say, well, look, there's some good that they do, but there's an awful lot wrong with them. We need to fix them. I think that's a perfectly legitimate position to take. And New Zealand also takes that approach to some degree when you look at the UN Security Council and the right of veto. New Zealand's a vocal critic of the veto, but it doesn't mean we pull out of the UN and take our ball and go home and say we're not going to play. It's more powerful, I think, if you stand up there in New York and say we don't like the way that this organization is run, here's why, and we're going to keep working to try and reform this system.
I mean, America first, as you say, but also Donald Trump wants America to be seen as this world leader, to have a significant sphere of influence on the geopolitical scene in all parts of the world. Is there a danger that by pulling out of these organizations, there will be a reduction of this sphere of influence? What's your thoughts, Jeffrey?
Well, look, the US is the world superpower, so in a way, the US can do this kind of thing. It can withdraw from multilateral organizations and still get its way just based on its size. And it can throw its weight around in a way that a country like New Zealand, for example, could never do. If we withdrew from the WHO, the rest of the world just simply wouldn't care, to be perfectly honest. but the United States, I mean, it can withdraw from these organizations, and yet its clout, its power, its global reach means it still have its voice heard. So that's another way of saying that smaller countries rely more on multilateral organizations and multilateral systems, or get more benefit perhaps from
Yeah.
them than bigger ones do. And that's why, multilateral organizations are particularly valuable to a country like New Zealand with 5 million people. It can achieve more through those avenues than perhaps big countries can, that can simply throw the weight of their military around and their voice, and they can get a lot done that way. So I guess the thing is, once one country pulls out from these
Yeah.
organizations, and agreements, do others follow? Do others, then see this as a license? Well, the US is not involved. It's not that important. Maybe we should pull out. We can save our subscription fee as well.
Mm.
And then at some point, you end up with an organization or an agreement that is not very representative. You end up with a Paris Agreement that just has,
Yeah.
I don't know, EU countries and a few others involved. And then it all becomes quite meaningless. So the strength in these organizations, really, these big multilateral ones, UN organizations, is that everyone's involved. And once they end up as smaller organizations, well, they're not particularly representative or diverse.
You mentioned beforehand that this is straight out of Trump's playbook from his first presidency. But wanting to specifically talk about NATO, because of course there was a lot of noise in the first presidency about how other countries needed to pay their fair share with NATO, that America was doing all of the heavy lifting. Do you think that we will also see this with NATO? Of course, particularly with what's happening with Ukraine and Russia at the moment. Ukraine desperately looking for NATO membership. Is that the next play from Trump, do you think?
Yes, I think he will certainly be asking NATO members to pay up and pay more. And Donald Trump, in some ways, was ahead of the curve on this, going
Yep.
back to 2018, 2019. He was saying NATO countries needed to pay up more and do more. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine happened, and suddenly NATO countries
Yep.
did step up, and they did increase their defence budgets in a big way. So Donald Trump, I'm no doubt, will see himself as being ahead of the curve on all of that, and will be wanting countries to continue that. They'll
Yep.
be wanting them not to spend just 2% of GDP. A lot of them are now at that level,
Mhm.
but wanting to spend 3%, 4% of GDP on defense spending in the way that the United States does. I think the US is close to 4% from memory, 3.5% thereabouts. So that will be, I guess, one of the big issues of the term, and I think that has relevance to New Zealand, because we're going to see no doubt the AUKUS debate regain steam now. We've got the Donald Trump in the White House, and whether New Zealand becomes involved in Pillar 2 or not of that agreement, whether Pillar 2 even survives
Yep.
the transition. Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, was speaking to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week, and he was quite enthusiastic about AUKUS, which is the first time we've really had any sense of whether the new administration is going to back AUKUS. That said, it could just be that that's the original nuclear-powered submarine deal for Australia. That's what he's going to support. Doesn't necessarily mean that Trump will support the also-rans, as he might see them, like New Zealand getting involved in Pillar 2. But I think if he does, it will be on the condition that New Zealand has to pay up massively.
Yeah.
And anyone who wants to be involved, they won't be free riding anymore. Because I think, in a way, Joe Biden and the Biden administration, they would have been happy in a way for New Zealand just to sign up, because it was about getting New Zealand's name on the list and the signature there. That was the achievement. I don't think that Donald Trump will see things in the same way. It will be very much, well, if you want to be on board, you need to increase your military spending. You need to buy a lot of new US military hardware,
Yeah.
and contribute, and no free riding with us. So it will be, I think, quite a different deal.
Yeah.
That New
Certainly
Zealand
less of a sweet
is
deal,
offered.
yeah, and may not be on the table, may not be politically tenable for New Zealand to be a part of Tier 2. We'll see what the guy that wrote the book on the art of the deal puts forward and see what's available there. I mean, the other big thing, of course, for New Zealand is tariffs, the Trump tariffs, and the impact that that's likely to have not just on exports, but on the global economy generally, and the impact that this is likely to have on the economy here in New Zealand. This was certainly talked a lot about in the campaign. Any signs of this in this first 24 hours, Jeffrey?
I don't think tariffs, the details of that really have come clear. I think that will be a detail issue that gets worked through. But yes, that's a big issue. He's promised a 10 to 20% general tariff for goods and services coming in to the United States, from all around the globe, an even bigger tariff on China. That will be hugely harmful to New Zealand if that came through. So no doubt that issue will be discussed, but I think that Trump will probably backpedal to some degree. There may be some tariffs added on some products, but he's got the problem that if he does really implement wholesale tariffs on products in the United States, it really will increase inflation massively to US consumers, and that's something that he's railed against. It was a big campaign issue, so I think that one will be walked back to some degree. It's always hard to know with Donald Trump how much you should believe, how much is hyperbole, how much is going to be implemented. I think somewhere it will be somewhere in the middle. There will be tariffs, but perhaps not as sweeping as was proposed during the campaign. And the old saying about you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose, I think that will apply to the tariff issue.
Exactly. And certainly the US economy tanking in the second Trump presidency, he won't want that to be his legacy in that regard. Hey, just finally on this one, and honestly, Jeffrey, this is a big enough issue in and of itself. Just a few hours before Donald Trump's inauguration, the ceasefire in Gaza kicked in. Prisoners have been exchanged. It's been celebrations on the West Bank. There's been some more saber rattling from Netanyahu. To what extent do you think the imminent inauguration of Donald Trump was the tipping point that led to peace for Israel and Gaza?
It was hugely important. Look, it was the catalyst. Donald Trump sent his special envoy to Israel to really talk some sense into Benjamin Netanyahu, and that seemed to be what got the deal over the line in the end. I mean, of course, there were plenty of others involved, and there were plenty involved in the Biden administration, Antony Blinken and so forth. But why the deal happened on January 19th? Well, Donald Trump was becoming president on January 20th. I think that's quite clear. But it's a fragile ceasefire when you look at what's happening on the ground. There've been various clashes still, even in Gaza, with Israeli soldiers and Palestinians. There've been number of Palestinians killed over in the West Bank where the ceasefire doesn't apply. It's a very, very fragile ceasefire. It's very good news to see those initial hostages, 3 hostages, freed and released to go back to their families. It's very good to see Palestinians being able to move around Gaza, and aid is flowing through. 900 trucks or more have come through since Sunday. So that's very good to see, but it's an absolute catastrophic scene. When you look at some of the pictures coming out of Gaza, I encourage your listeners, if they haven't done so already, to look at just some of those aerial shots from drones, etc. It looks like something out of World War II Germany after the war ended. Just an absolute sea of rubble, an absolute moonscape, and it's going to take a colossal effort to rebuild Gaza. Even though you expected that, it's still quite shocking when you see some of these first pictures coming through after the ceasefire has taken place and the full extent of the damage. It's quite shocking.
I mean, comparing it to World War II, although I saw some stats which says that the amount of bombing which has happened in this very small piece of real estate exceeds the bombings of London and Dresden and even Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, actually, within a relatively brief period of time. Of course, for Trump to be able to say, hey, I was the peacemaker in Israel, that's good news for him. And also for Benjamin Netanyahu to say, hey, look, we've got the hostages back, I've done the deal. That will be good for both presidents politically, but also, hopefully, optimistically perhaps, good news for the people of Gaza to start the slow process of rebuilding. Jeffrey, appreciate your insights and your wisdom as always. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.